And I'm also a founding member of the Critical Psychiatry Network, as is Joe Moncrief. Yeah. My talk may well take some of Peter's issues forward, I hope. It is about the definition of critical psychiatry and its differences. Critical psychiatry may not be well defined. It has its roots in so-called anti-psychiatry. Anti-psychiatry in the 1960s and 70s was an anti-authoritarian, popular, even romantic attack on psychiatrists' use of psychiatric diagnosis, drug and ECT treatment, and involuntary hospitalization. It was associated with the names of R.D. Laing and Thomas Szasz. Here's my definition of critical psychiatry. The essential critique is that the biomedical hypothesis that functional mental illness is due to brain disease is based on faith, desire, and wish fulfillment rather than logic. This could be seen as quite a strong statement. Furthermore, critical psychiatry suggests that taking a biomedical, reductionistic position may have adverse consequences. So objectification of the mentally ill by reducing their problems to brain disease may make psychiatry part of the problem rather than necessarily the solution to mental illness. And I want to use the work of Clifford Geertz to reinforce this view. Like a religion, psychiatry expresses a view about the nature of the world that provides what Geertz called an aura of factuality. The biomedical model does not actually describe the real world, but it seems to do so. Because of this, it therefore justifies treatments such as physical interventions. It gives a clear direction to psychiatry and creates a worldview which provides certainty, so that if psychiatrists did not believe the hypothesis, they would be left with too much ambiguity in their practice. To quote from Geertz, "Man depends upon symbols and symbol systems with a dependence so great as to be decisive for his creatural viability, and as a result, his sensitivity to even the remotest indication that they may prove unable to cope with one another or aspect of experience raises within him the gravest sort of anxiety." So viewed in this way, it's not surprising that people don't want to give up the biomedical model. To do so is like giving up one's religion. In keeping the reference to religion, I want to suggest that critical psychiatry is a broad church. And post-psychiatry, as in the title of the book by Pat Bracken and Phil Thomas, is one form of critical psychiatry. It's difficult to deny that critical psychiatry developed in an organized way at the same time as the emphasis on post-structuralism, and there have been parallel developments of other critical subdisciplines such as critical psychology and critical social work. And maybe critical psychiatry is no different in that respect. There is a debate within critical psychiatry about how much it is tied to postmodernism. And I've always been skeptical about whether critical psychiatry is really based on Foucault. From my point of view, in a sense, there's always been a conceptual split between understanding mental illness in psychological and physiological terms. So, for example, at the 1910 Triennial Medical Congress at Washington, Ernest Southard called these the mind twist and brain spot hypotheses in psychopathology and neuropathology. And perhaps before the psychological camp was taken up by psychoanalysis, there were, in Southard's views, two great groups of friendly opponents in the field of psychiatric theory. And the fundamental distinction was between those that identify a psychogenic cause of mental illness and those that emphasize brain etiology. The majority view has always been physicalist. However, I just want to emphasize that there have also always been alternative views. So, to use an example from the 19th century, Philippe Pinel saw mental disorder as lesions of the function of understanding. And to quote from him, "It's a general and very natural opinion that derangement of the functions of the understanding consists in a change or lesion of some part of the head. But the numerous results of dissection, which have shown no organic lesion of the head, appear to establish a contrary opinion." And this conclusion about the results of post-mortem dissections was contrary to many other authors at the time, and critical psychiatry's critique of modern studies is a minority view in the same way. But Pinel demonstrates his functional understanding of mental illness, like critical psychiatry. Similarly, Ernst von Feuchtersleben, who's been called a forgotten psychiatrist, published his book, The Principles of Medical Psychology, in 1845, the same year as Wilhelm Griesinger's Mental Pathology and Therapeutics, often seen as the origin of modern biomedical views. And to quote from von Feuchtersleben, "The notion mental diseased must be deduced neither from the mind nor from the body, but from the relation of each to the other." Feuchtersleben, therefore, had an integrated understanding of mind and brain. To quote again from him, "Psychopathologies, by which he meant mental illness, have no seat. They are combined constitutions which appear in the disturbance of these functions by which the mind is manifested, that is, in the collective personality." And there may have been vitalistic undertones in this functional perspective, and Pinel was also influenced by vitalism. But the point I'm making is that the questioning of the biological basis of mental illness goes back a long way and doesn't just have its origins with modern critical psychiatry. As the 19th century developed and medicine started linking clinical signs with physical pathology, psychiatry didn't really fit in. Of course, there were some successes, such as the recognition of tertiary syphilis, but otherwise, positive histological findings were essentially lacking. So it was significant that Franz Nissl, possibly the greatest neuropathologist of his day, concluded in 1908 it was a bad mistake not to realize that the findings of brain anatomy bore no relationship to psychiatric findings, particularly because he had regarded all psychoses as having positive cortical findings. This, of course, did not mean that mental illness did not have its origins in the brain, just that it's functional and not localized. And to quote from Adolf Meyer, mental disorders show through the brain, but not necessarily in the brain. What I want to do is to move on to look at some differences within critical psychiatry. And by doing so, we may become clearer about its essence. The challenge to the biomedical hypothesis can lead to disagreement within critical psychiatry. And although they're perhaps not totally distinct, I've divided these issues into three areas. Firstly, whether psychiatry should be seen as a medical discipline. Secondly, whether the Mental Health Act should be abolished. And thirdly, whether it's suitable to see mental disorder as illness and disease. So the first issue is about whether psychiatry is a medical discipline. Where there's agreement is that psychiatry is different from medicine. The disagreements arise because of how much is made of that difference. Some want to go as far as saying that psychiatry should be non-medical. Others emphasize that medicine covers both physical and mental aspects. And the reality is that many patients do complain of physical symptoms which have psychosocial origins, and any view on this issue has to take note of psychosomatic medicine. Second issue is about coercion, and where there's agreement is that critical psychiatry emphasizes the rights of people with mental health problems. This emphasis leads some to argue for abolishing all forced treatment, and others to accept that detention can be justified by the loss of mental capacity and mental illness. And all would accept that psychiatric abuse is not justified and coercion needs to be minimized. Third issue is about whether mental disorder should be seen as illness or disease. And where there's agreement is that all identify there's a problem with seeing mental disorder as brain disease. But the questions are, should it be seen as illness, and is psychiatric diagnosis valid? And some conclude that mental disorder is not illness, and alternatives are required to psychiatric diagnosis. And others accept that psychological dysfunction can be understood as illness, and that diagnostic concepts should be understood for what they are, which is what Peters was saying. Diagnoses should not be reified, that's what the problem is, and seen as things. Instead, they are merely idealized, conceptual, hypothetical constructs, and if they have any value, they should be understood as such. So to flesh out these differences, I want to look at a couple of examples and to offer my simplistic critique of these references. And firstly, there's the book Mad Science by Kirk, Gomori, and Cohen, who are three social workers. And this is a work of critical psychiatry because it comes from the position that mental disorders have not been established to be brain diseases. But then it goes further and suggests that the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of those identified as mentally ill are normal human experiences. Their critique leads them to conclude that professionals should only offer voluntary treatment, and that physicians' prescription for privileges should be abolished. There are lots of critical books about psychiatry, but maybe this book provides the clearest arguments. It's The Death of Thomas Sass for the abandonment of coercive psychiatry. I don't totally agree with it. I do think that loss of mental capacity and mental illness can justify psychiatric detention. Although all the authors are social workers, they find it difficult to accept that psychiatry has a social role in managing madness on behalf of society, which I think is an inevitable role. And personally, I have no objection to the development of non-medical prescribing with proper training, but this doesn't mean that medical training is not of value for psychiatry. At least as a doctor, I understand the context of mental illness within medicine. Let's look at a second example, and here I turn to the 2015 paper entitled Schizophrenia, a Critical Perspective. And as we heard from Peter, the authors are Joe Moncrief and Hugh Middleton, and they are the current chairs of the UK Critical Psychiatry Network. And I'm not raising this to have a go at Joe like Peter did, but I think it is important to look at what the differences are. And the authors start from the essential critical psychiatry perspective that mental illness, such as schizophrenia, is not brain disease. And they go further to conclude that the concept of schizophrenia is neither valid nor useful, and that it should be replaced with more generic concepts such as psychosis or madness. So in general, they suggest it's inappropriate to regard mental disorders as illness and disease. And in a way, like Peter, I don't totally agree. I don't define illness as physical illness. I would argue that abnormalities of mental function can be understood as illnesses in the same way as bodily dysfunctions. There are inevitable limitations in the application of psychiatric diagnoses, such as schizophrenia, whatever way symptoms and signs are grouped and conceptualized. So what needs to happen is that psychiatric practice needs to acknowledge this state of uncertainty. Concepts of mental illness do not necessarily need to be abandoned for this reason alone. They merely need to be recognized for what they are, attempts to describe psychological states. So, in summary, critical psychiatry in philosophical terms does have ontological, epistemological, and moral assumptions, and we do need to do more to clarify these foundations. And one way of doing this may be to look at differences within critical psychiatry, and I've touched upon these in this talk with examples. So, in conclusion, the essential position of challenging the claim that mental disorders have been established to be brain diseases can lead to some differing perspectives within critical psychiatry itself. Thank you very much.
Douglas, thank you for your talk. I just wondered if, as from the perspective of critical psychiatry, I think my major reservation with the movement, as it is that it talks about psychiatric diagnosis in this global sense. And so, if you actually look at what in the DSM, there are conditions who almost no one would debate are brain diseases. Huntington's disease, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease. They have neuropathological changes, some going back even to Dissel, on the one hand. On the opposite end of the spectrum in the DSM, there are conditions like adjustment disorders, which I, for one, would be very skeptical to find out that there's absolutely anything wrong in people's brains with adjustment disorders whatsoever. And then there's sort of everything in between. And so I think one thing that I would encourage critical psychiatrists to do is to think about what the examples are that are the most troubling, and then acknowledge that there are non-troubling examples too. And I think that would then make your ideas much more receptive to psychiatry broadly conceived.
That's very, very helpful. I was trying to be careful to say I meant functional mental illness. Obviously, there are organic conditions. People can have a toxic infusional state, they can have a dementia, and there's a physical basis for that. I am talking about functional mental illness, but I am also including schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And it was DSM-4 that abolished the distinction between functional and organic mental illness, and that distinction needs to be reinstated.
I have a question. I mean, I don't know where it would fit into your framework, but when I think about what it is that a professional who's gone to medical school sort of brings to the table of understanding these problems, however you want to characterize, what that person can do. For me, it comes down to two things. One is to be an expert on the describing mental status, being able to describe mental states and understanding when there's sort of variations in common function. So, for instance, the distinction between what we call delirium and, let's say, psychosis is something that psychiatrists have training that's very helpful, and it can be very confusing if you don't have that framework, and it can have a lot of important implications in understanding what could be awry in the person. It doesn't, I don't know what you do about the problem classification because it's so problematic, but just that descriptor and being attuned to that seems helpful. And the second thing is that it seems to me self-evident that humans like to take psychoactive drugs. I mean, there's a lot of coffee here today. There's probably going to be other substances that people use tonight to, for various reasons. And that having a field within medicine that is an expert, where there's an expertise in understanding psychoactive drugs. I mean, I'm very much influenced by Joanne Moncrief's drug center review, but having a well-developed expertise in that seems to be a useful contribution. And what about psychiatry doing those two things? And leaving everything else to other people that are interested in doing all the other things that might help people to navigate the world in a better way.
I mean, essentially, I agree with what you're saying, and critical psychiatry is emphasising that what's needed is formulation of people's problems, that was the way in which I was trained. I was trained to, take a full psychiatric history, including family history and personal history. You look in the notes these days, you hardly even get a family history and personal history from some psychiatrists, because they're so focusing on the symptoms. But that's not my understanding of a full psychiatric assessment. So critical psychiatry is emphasising that the need for a full psychiatric assessment. And as far as medication is concerned, I think I heard you say that patients always want medication. Yeah, they do. The evidence is more ambiguous about that than you might think. A lot of people don't always want medication. You're right, and critical psychiatrists have to be very sensitive to the fact that people have come to accept a need for medication, maybe partly because they've been told that they need some sort of biochemical correction to a chemical imbalance. And that's, to my mind, that's partly why you actually get discontinuation problems, because people have become so habituated to taking medication that if you actually take them away, it's partly because of a psychological dependence. So I'm not saying you don't have to, I mean, as critical psychiatrists, we have to work in a world in which medication is widely prescribed. But I think we are, as you've mentioned Jo's work, and she's done a lot of this, you need to be much more skeptical about the evidence than is generally the case. And in the UK, we have a body called the NICE Guidelines, which produces guidelines for psychiatrists. Most psychiatrists actually prescribe beyond the evidence. Critical psychiatry, in some ways, sticks closer to the NICE Guidelines than most psychiatrists.
Michael, another question about, so one of the 10 principles of these aspects of critical psychiatry is that disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar are not brain diseases. How does people with that perspective explain the studies which show brain scans, both functional and structural, where you get 1,000 people who have the DSM diagnosis of schizophrenia, whatever you think it is, compare it with people who don't, you see physical correlates that go along with these diagnoses. OCD, lots of different disorders. That's the kind of evidence that at least people in psychiatry, I think, believe. However inaccurate and invalid the DSM is, the core of the correlation between stuff in the physical world and these constructs would seem to argue that there is something beyond, that there is some brain phenomenon that's connected to these concepts. No?
No. And, well, I don't think I need to explain, because I don't think you can tell me what the physical abnormality is of schizophrenia from the brain scans. What is that abnormality?
Well, I'm not saying we understand it, but to say that there's
No, exactly.
But if you get serious have the diagnosis, you can show that that is consistently different than people who don't.
No, that's not true. That's not true. That's not true. And we can debate the evidence, but there are no brain scans that have actually determined the physical abnormality underlying schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. It's misleading to say that studies have confirmed what that is. That's wrong to say that.
Hi, so I think I might have perhaps missed or misinterpreted the valence of your talk, but from this talk and the one previous, it seems like you're talking about psychiatry almost as like this perfectly circumscribed entity in order to like understand, like, I guess in this case you brought up the Mental Health Act and coercion and also medicine's own epistemic commitments. And I guess when thinking about like functional mental illness, it seems to be like a disorder that's judged by kind of like a contingent like norm of functioning. So I was wondering like how critical psychiatry sort of historicizes psychiatry and puts it into the larger sort of like social networks, economics, and like other systems of power that it's a part of and kind of time to reinforce, if that makes sense. If not, I'm sorry.
I suppose I am, in a way, making much more of a historical case than, I went into it in a little bit by mentioning Pinel and von Feuchtersleben. What I'm saying is that there always has been a minority critical view, if you like. I mean, the majority view has always been biomedical. And obviously, I'm well aware of the histories of the origins of psychiatry, and it's really only in the 20th century that voluntary treatment and community treatment has developed. But I don't think critical psychiatry is saying we don't recognise a need for the Mental Health Act. And obviously, coercion needs to be minimised. But there are times when society does need to intervene in the interest of a person's health or safety, or for protection of other people. And there are times when people may commit crimes because of loss of mental capacity. Obviously there is that debate within critical psychiatry, and that was what I was referencing. But my personal position is still that psychiatry has to act on behalf of society to manage madness in society.
Yeah, I guess like what I meant to say is that like the Mental Health Act refers to deinstitutionalization, correct? Is that right? Or like the Mental Health Act refers to like the process of deinstitutionalization. Is that right? I guess like in thinking about deinstitutionalization, like that wasn't just something that came internally from psychiatry. I mean, that had a lot to do with like the other like social and historical view at the time, and like I just like wonder how critical psychiatry accounts for systems of power that like aren't just unique to psychiatry itself.
I think people have always intervened the difference in the 19th century was the development of society, and society actually setting up an organisation to manage madness. So I don't think you can get away from the sort of social need for psychiatry. Is that answering it?
Sure. Well, yes.
I'm just giving my personal position. I have pointed to the fact that there is that debate within critical psychiatry, and obviously there are some people that do want to abolish the Mental Health Act, and you may be one of them.
Maybe.
All right, Scott, I'll give you the last question.
Yeah, it's not a question, it's a statement. namely that it's a little after 5, so we should thank our last speaker. And I wanted to remind everyone of what was announced at the beginning of the day, which is that any of you interested in joining any of the rest of us for dinner can meet up in front of the Omni Hotel at 6:30, and we'll somehow coalesce into various groups and wander through the Gaslamp district and find places to eat and Sandy was implying perhaps buy adulterating substances as well. Yeah. So that's my statement. So we'll reconvene tomorrow at what's it, 8?
It's 8 o'clock. The room will be 12.
8:15. Thank you.